A journalist and a fallen lawyer risk everything to expose the corruption hiding beneath a town's dam before it collapses. The rusted pickup coughed twice before the engine finally surrendered into a tired idle. Rachel Whitaker kept one hand on the wheel and looked through the cracked windshield at the wooden sign welcoming visitors to Ock-Haven. The letters had once been painted white. Now they were the color of old bone. The town itself stretched beyond the sign like a place that had been holding its breath for years. 2 streets, a gas station, a diner, a bar that leaned slightly to the left, as if the weight of too many stories had pushed it off balance. Rachel killed the engine and stepped out. The air smelled like wet wood and distant water. Somewhere behind the tree line the dam stood. Her reason for driving 9 hours through rain and dust in a truck that had no right to survive another mile. She pulled a folded document from the passenger seat. The headline printed across the page was simple: budget increase approved for Ock-Haven dam renovation. The number below, it was not simple. $12 million for a town that barely reached 2,000 residents. The IT was the kind of number that did not belong here, the kind that left fingerprints. She slid the paper back into her bag and walked toward the bar. The wooden door creaked when she pushed it open. Inside, the room smelled of beer and motor oil. A few locals sat along the counter talking in low voices. Their conversation paused the moment Rachel stepped inside. She felt their eyes before she even reached the bar. Towns like this had a way of measuring strangers in seconds. She ordered black coffee from the bartender, a thick man with gray hair and the posture of someone who had worked too many years behind the same counter that he poured without asking questions. But questions were already building in the room. One man glanced at her boots. Another studied the notebook sticking out of her bag. She had seen that look before. The quiet suspicion reserved for outsiders who carried notebooks. Rachel took a slow sip and scanned the walls. Photos hung in crooked frames. Old fishing competitions, fire department celebrations, a ribbon-cutting ceremony in front of the dam 20 years earlier. The structure in the photo looked clean then, concrete bright under the sun. She pulled her phone out and zoomed in on the image. Her instincts tightened. Something about the dam in that photograph felt different from the drone pictures she had studied the night before. She was still looking at it when a chair scraped across the wooden floor behind her. A man had just entered. He moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who knew exactly how much attention he attracted and did not care to reduce it. He wore a dark jacket and carried the smell of lake water with him. His beard was short, his hair dark with streaks of gray. The bartender gave him a nod that carried familiarity but not friendliness. The man sat 2 stools away from Rachel and ordered whiskey. No greeting, no small talk. Rachel recognized the silence around him instantly. The room had adjusted itself around his presence like metal around a magnet. She leaned slightly toward the bartender. "Who's the shadow at the end of the bar?" Rachel asked, keeping her voice low. The bartender didn't stop his mechanical scrubbing of a clouded pint glass. "That's Caleb Mercer, best boat mechanic in the county," he muttered, then leaned in, his voice dropping an octave. "Also the only man in Ock-Haven who remembers what this town looked like before the state money started flowing and the questions stopped being asked. Most folks here find it easier to forget. He don't." He set the glass down with a definitive thud. "If you're looking for a tour guide, keep looking. He's got no use for outsiders, especially ones with a press pass and an itch for trouble." Rachel waited. That was not the full story. She could hear the missing details in the way the bartender said it. But the bartender did not volunteer them. She turned her head toward the man instead. "You fix engines?" The man took a sip of whiskey before responding. "Sometimes." His voice was calm but heavy, the kind of voice that did not waste words. Rachel extended a hand across the small distance between them. "Rachel Whitaker, journalist." The man glanced at her hand but did not take it. "Caleb." That was all. No last name. She lowered her hand slowly. "I'm writing about the dam renovation." The reaction was immediate but subtle. That Caleb's eyes shifted toward the window where the river curved behind the trees. Then he finished his whiskey in a single motion. "Bad topic for a visitor." Rachel smiled faintly. Bad topics are usually the interesting ones. Caleb placed money on the counter and stood. He was taller than she had expected. His shadow stretched across the bar floor. "This town doesn't do interesting," he said. "It does quiet." Rachel leaned back on the stool. "Quiet costs $12 million now." A couple of the locals glanced up from their drinks to Caleb's gaze returned to her for the first time fully. There was no anger in it, just something older and colder. Experience measuring risk. You drove a long way for trouble, he said. I drove for truth. Caleb almost laughed. The sound that left him was closer to a dry breath. Truth? He looked around the bar slowly, letting the room settle back into silence. Then he leaned slightly closer to her, voice low enough that only she could hear. In Ock-Haven, he said, people don't look for truth. Rachel felt the weight of his words before he finished the sentence. They bury it. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain outside began again, tapping softly against the windows. Caleb straightened and turned toward the door. The conversation was over for him. But Rachel was not done. Caleb, she said. He stopped but did not turn. If the truth is buried, she continued, someone had to dig the hole. Caleb stood still for 2 seconds. Then he opened the door. The rain blew inside briefly. That's the part, he said quietly. You're not ready to understand. The door closed behind him, leaving the bar heavy with unfinished words. Rachel watched through the window as he crossed the muddy street and disappeared between the dark outlines of boats near the river. She took another sip of coffee. It had gone cold. But the story had just begun, and somewhere beyond the trees the dam waited. $12 million of concrete and silence, hiding something that someone in this town would kill to keep buried. Rachel opened her notebook and wrote 2 words at the top of the page. Caleb, then beneath it another line. Ock-Haven does not hide secrets, it protects them. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the roof like distant footsteps marching towards something inevitable. Rachel woke before sunrise in the small motel room above the diner. The ceiling fan turned slowly above her bed, making a quiet clicking sound every few seconds. She had learned long ago that small towns woke early. The best information always appeared before the official day began. She dressed quickly, grabbed her notebook, and stepped outside. The air carried the cold, damp smell of the river. Fog hung low across Ock-Haven, softening the edges of buildings that looked older than they probably were. The dam stood somewhere beyond the trees, invisible but present. She could feel it in the distant sound of water moving through concrete channels. She reached the diner just as the cook unlocked the door. Inside, the room smelled of coffee and frying bacon. The waitress gave Rachel a cautious smile, the kind reserved for strangers who had not yet proven themselves harmless. Rachel ordered eggs and coffee, but her attention remained on the folded documents spread across the table. She had spent most of the night reviewing the digital copies sent by a contact from the State Infrastructure Office. The renovation project had begun 10 years earlier. Back then, the official estimate had been $4 million. Now it was 12. The numbers had grown quietly over the years like mold spreading across damp walls. But the line that had stopped her cold appeared on page 14, a legal authorization signature. The name beneath it was Caleb Mercer. She stared at the printed signature again. Caleb, she had not known his last name yesterday. Now it was staring at her from a document that authorized the first contract payment to the construction company responsible for the dam repair. She tapped her pen slowly against the paper. There were 2 possibilities. Point 1. Caleb Mercer had been part of the corruption. Point 2. Someone had used his name. The second possibility felt stronger. The man she met in the bar had the posture of someone who carried anger but not guilt. She finished her coffee and folded the papers back into her bag. The sun was barely climbing above the trees when she reached the river. The docks stretched along the muddy shoreline. Small fishing boats rocked gently in the water. The workshop stood at the end of the pier. Its metal roof reflected the pale morning light. She heard the sound of tools before she reached the door. A wrench striking metal with precise rhythm. She stepped inside. Caleb stood over an overturned engine block, his hands black with grease. He glanced up once, then returned to his work. You found my shop faster than most tourists, he said. Rachel placed the document on the workbench between them. I'm not a tourist. Caleb wiped his hands with a cloth but did not touch the paper. No, he said quietly. You're worse. Rachel slid the document toward him until the signature line faced his direction. Recognize that? Caleb looked down. His expression did not change for several seconds. Then something in his jaw tightened. He picked up the paper slowly, studying the signature as if confirming a memory he already knew too well. Where did you get this? Rachel crossed her arms. State Infrastructure Archive. Caleb gave a short breath that might have been a laugh. Of course. Rachel leaned forward. You signed the authorization for the first payment to the construction company working on the dam point 10 years ago. Caleb set the document down carefully. No, he said. I didn't. Rachel watched his face closely. Your name is on it. Yes. Your signature. Caleb finally met her eyes. No silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sound of water moving past the docks. Rachel opened her notebook. Then explain. Caleb leaned against the workbench and folded his arms. His gaze moved briefly toward the river. 10 years ago, he said, I was a lawyer in this town. Rachel wrote quickly. Caleb continued. Small practice, contract reviews, property disputes, boring work, but honest. He tapped the paper lightly. Then the dam renovation contracts came through to my firm handled the legal approvals. Rachel looked up, and Caleb's voice hardened slightly. And I refused to sign. Rachel stopped writing. Why? Because the numbers didn't match, he said. Material costs inflated, subcontractors that didn't exist, invoices that arrived before the work started. Rachel felt a spark of excitement run through her chest. So you blocked the contract. I tried. Caleb picked up the paper again and held it under the light. 3 weeks later, this document appeared in the official file, with my signature. Rachel frowned. Forgery. Exactly. Rachel flipped through her notes. Did you challenge it? Caleb smiled without humor. Of course I did. What happened? Caleb looked toward the open workshop door where the river shimmered under the rising sun. My firm fired me the same week, he said. Professional misconduct, they called it. Rachel stared at him. They blamed you. Caleb nodded once. Forgery is hard to prove when the town already believes you're guilty. Rachel closed her notebook slowly. The story had just become larger than she expected. Who benefited from the contract approval? Caleb did not answer immediately. He walked to the edge of the dock and looked toward the distant tree line where the dam stood invisible. You're asking the wrong question, he said. Rachel followed him outside. What's the right one? Caleb turned slightly. Who had the power to make the town believe the lie? Rachel understood before he said the name. Sheriff? Caleb nodded. Sheriff Daniel Miller. Rachel wrote the name quickly. The ink pressed harder into the page than before. He controlled the investigation? He controlled everything. Rachel looked back at the workshop, then at the river flowing quietly beside them. And you just disappeared? Caleb shrugged. Hard to practice law when nobody in town will hire you. Rachel studied him carefully. The pieces were beginning to fit, but one part still bothered her. Why stay? Caleb looked surprised. What? If the town destroyed your career, why stay here? Caleb rested his hands on the wooden railing of the dock. The river moved slowly beneath them, reflecting pale sunlight. Because leaving would mean they won. Rachel felt something shift inside her perception of him. He was not hiding, that he was waiting. You've been watching them, she said quietly. Caleb did not deny it. 10 years, he said. Long enough to understand how they operate. Rachel lifted the document again. Then help me expose them. Caleb turned his head toward her. His expression carried the weight of 10 years of silence. You have no idea what you're asking, he said. Rachel stepped closer. I know exactly what I'm asking. Caleb studied her face, measuring the determination there. The same determination that had driven her 9 hours into a town that buried truth. Finally, he looked back toward the river. You publish stories, he said. People read them for a day. Then they move on. Rachel shook her head. Not this one. Caleb's voice lowered. Sheriff Miller doesn't lose. Rachel opened her bag and placed a second folder on the dock. These were drone photographs of the dam taken 2 nights earlier. The concrete walls showed uneven patches where repairs had supposedly been completed. She pointed at the images. Tell me something, she said. If $12 million went into fixing that dam, why does it look like it's falling apart? Caleb stared at the photos. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then he took one of them and held it closer to the light. Because, he said slowly, it probably is. Rachel waited. Caleb looked at her again. You're not chasing a corruption story, he said. You're chasing a structural disaster. Rachel felt the tension rise inside her chest. Meaning? Caleb handed the photo back. Meaning if the materials were falsified, he said, that dam isn't safe. The river behind them moved quietly, carrying the same water that pressed against the concrete structure beyond. The trees, For the first time since arriving in Ock-Haven, Rachel felt the true weight of the story she had stepped into. This was no longer about money. It was about time, and time was running out. The sheriff's office sat at the corner of Ock-Haven's main street like a building that had grown used to watching everyone who passed. It was made of dark brick, with a single flag moving slowly in the wind above the entrance. Rachel stood across the street studying it for a moment before walking forward. She had learned something important over the years. People with power often preferred their enemies to hide, which meant the fastest way to understand them was to step directly into their space. The door opened with a soft metallic click. The inside smelled faintly of dust and old paper. A radio murmured somewhere in the back of the office, repeating weather reports about rain moving through the county. A deputy behind the front desk looked up from his computer. He was young, early 20s maybe, the kind of young that still believed the badge on his chest meant something permanent. "Can I help you?" Rachel offered a professional smile. "Rachel Whitaker, State Press." She placed her press card on the counter. The deputy studied it for a moment, then nodded toward a closed office door at the far end of the room. "Sheriff's inside." Rachel thanked him and walked across the floor. Her boots echoed slightly against the polished wood. She knocked once before opening the door. Sheriff Daniel Miller sat behind a wide desk stacked with neatly arranged folders. He looked up slowly, removing a pair of reading glasses from his face. His hair was gray but thick, his posture straight. The room behind him held framed awards and photographs of town events where he stood in the center, smiling beside local politicians that he studied Rachel for. Several seconds before speaking. "Journalists don't usually visit Ock-Haven," he said calmly. "Not without calling first." Rachel stepped inside and closed the door. Spontaneity keeps the job interesting. Miller gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Rachel did. He folded his hands on the desk, his expression polite but distant. "What can I do for you, Ms. Whitaker?" Rachel pulled a single photo from her bag and placed it on the desk. It was the drone image of the dam. Caleb had circled the uneven sections with a black marker earlier that morning. Miller glanced at the photo, but his expression did not change. "Infrastructure story?" he asked, something like that. Rachel leaned forward slightly. "The renovation project has tripled its budget in 10 years. Miller nodded calmly. "Large projects often do." Rachel tapped the photo. "Concrete usually doesn't crack after a renovation." Miller's eyes rested on the image again, that he slid it back toward her. "Our engineers haven't reported structural concerns." Rachel watched him carefully. He was smooth. Too smooth. The kind of calm that came from years of controlling conversations. "Interesting," she said. "Because some of the contracts connected to the renovation appear questionable." Miller leaned back in his chair. "That sounds like a matter for the state office." Rachel reached into her bag again and placed the authorization document on the desk. The signature line faced him. This time Miller's eyes stayed on the paper a fraction longer before returning to her. "Caleb Mercer," he said quietly. "You spoke with him." Rachel didn't answer. Miller's lips curved slightly into something close to a smile. "That man has a long history of blaming others for his mistakes." Rachel crossed her arms. "Forgery isn't a mistake." Miller's gaze sharpened slightly. "Alleged forgery." Rachel held his stare. "He says you controlled the investigation." Silence stretched across the office for a moment. Then Miller stood slowly and walked toward the window behind his desk. He looked out across the quiet street, where 2 cars moved lazily past the diner. "Small towns function on trust," he said finally. "When someone violates that trust, the community remembers." Rachel leaned back in the chair. "Communities also remember corruption." Miller turned around and he walked back to the desk, but did not sit. Instead, he reached into one of the drawers and removed a small photograph. He placed it gently beside the contract document. Rachel looked down. The picture showed a small suburban house in another state that a woman stood in the yard beside a teenage boy. Rachel felt the air shift slightly in the room. "My sister," she said carefully. Miller nodded, his thumb tracing the edge of the frame with a rhythmic, unsettling precision. "And your nephew plays soccer on weekends at the park on High Street, doesn't he?" The silence in the office suddenly felt vacuum-sealed, the air heavy with the scent of floor wax and stale tobacco. Rachel lifted her eyes slowly. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her hands flat on the desk. "You've done your homework," she said, her voice a cold wire. Miller didn't blink. He simply leaned forward. the light from the window catching the silver of his badge, casting a distorted reflection onto the photograph. In a town this small, Ms. Whitaker, I have to be thorough. It's my responsibility to know exactly who is entering my jurisdiction and what kind of baggage they might bring to people I care about. Rachel picked up the photograph, turning it once between her fingers before setting it back down. Threatening my family seems excessive. Miller shook his head lightly. Not a threat. He sat down again, folding his hands. Just friendly advice. Rachel waited. Ock-Haven is a quiet place, Miller continued. People here prefer their lives undisturbed. Rachel tilted her head slightly. And journalists disturb that. Sometimes. Miller's eyes held hers steadily. Sometimes they also misunderstand what they see. Rachel gathered the documents from the desk. Concrete mixed with sand isn't a misunderstanding. Miller's expression did not change, but something colder appeared behind his eyes. Be careful repeating rumors. Rachel stood. I prefer evidence. Miller remained seated, watching her calmly. Evidence has a way of disappearing in towns like this. Rachel walked to the door. She paused before opening it. You know, she said, someone once told me something interesting in the bar last night. Miller raised an eyebrow. What was that? Rachel looked back at him. That Ock-Haven doesn't look for truth. She opened the door slightly. It buries it. For the first time, Miller's smile faded completely. Rachel stepped into the hallway, closing the office door behind her. The deputy at the front desk glanced up as she walked out into the afternoon sunlight. The sky had darkened. Clouds gathered slowly above the trees near the river, promising another storm. Rachel reached the sidewalk and stopped beside her truck. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. The photograph of her sister still burned in her mind. Sheriff Miller had just made the rules of the game very clear. This story was no longer just professional, it was personal. And across town near the docks, Caleb Mercer was the only person who seemed willing to stand against the man who ruled Ock-Haven through silence. Rachel started the pickup engine and drove toward the river. The storm clouds above the dam continued to grow darker. By the time Rachel's pickup reached the river, the sky above Ock-Haven had turned the color of dull steel. Wind moved through the trees in slow, restless waves, pushing the scent of rain across the docks. At Caleb's workshop, doors stood half open. She stepped inside without knocking. The sound of metal tools striking wood had stopped. Caleb stood near a cluttered work table, studying something spread across its surface. He looked up when Rachel entered. His expression changed immediately the moment he saw her face. You went to see him. Rachel closed the door behind her. Sheriff Miller sends his regards. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. And Rachel dropped her bag onto the table. She pulled out the photograph Miller had shown her and placed it beside Caleb's tools. He knows where my sister lives. Caleb stared at the picture for several seconds. The silence in the workshop thickened with something darker than before. That means he's nervous, Caleb said quietly. Rachel let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Your definition of nervous involves threatening someone's family. Caleb crossed the room slowly. Miller doesn't waste effort unless he sees danger. Rachel leaned against the table. Congratulations. Then I'm officially dangerous. Caleb looked at the photograph again before sliding it back toward her. You shouldn't have gone to his office. Rachel shook her head. If I didn't show him the documents, he'd assume I was bluffing. Caleb folded his arms. And now he knows exactly how much you know. Rachel met his gaze. Good. Caleb studied her expression carefully. The same stubborn determination he had noticed the night before burned behind her eyes. He had seen that look before in courtrooms years ago. People who carried it rarely walked away from a fight once they stepped into it. You're staying, he said finally. Rachel shrugged. Seems that way. Caleb sighed quietly, then turned toward the large wooden cabinet against the wall. That he unlocked it with a small brass key and opened the doors. Inside, the shelves were stacked with folders and notebooks, each labeled with careful handwriting. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Boat repair records? Caleb pulled out 3 folders and placed them on the table. 10 years, he said. While everyone thought I was fixing engines, I was also paying attention. Rachel opened the first folder. Inside were copies of municipal reports, building permits, and contractor invoices. Some pages carried handwritten notes in the margins connecting names and numbers with thin arrows of black ink. You built your own investigation, she said. Caleb nodded, quietly. Rachel flipped through the papers quickly. The same construction company name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents to Ridgeline Structural Group. She looked up. This company handled most of the dam work. Caleb tapped another page, owned by a holding firm in another county. Rachel followed the arrow drawn across the margin, which connects to a shell corporation. Caleb nodded again. And that corporation donated heavily to Sheriff Miller's re-election campaigns. Rachel felt the familiar spark of adrenaline rise in her chest. There it is. Caleb watched her carefully. Money trail. Rachel closed the folder. Corruption confirmed. Caleb shook his head slowly. Not confirmed. Proving corruption requires evidence that survives court. Rachel pointed toward the documents. That's a start. Caleb's voice remained steady. A start that will disappear the moment Miller realizes how close you are. Rachel leaned forward. Then we moved faster. Thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the river. The storm was approaching. Caleb looked toward the open door where the wind had begun to push rain across the dock. You should leave Ock-Haven tonight, he said. Rachel blinked. What? You have enough information to start writing. Rachel laughed softly. That's not how this works. Caleb's voice hardened slightly. That is exactly how this works if you want to stay alive. Rachel's eyes narrowed. I didn't drive 9 hours to publish half a story. Caleb stepped closer, lowering his voice. You drove into a town controlled by a man who's been burying problems for a decade. Rachel held his stare. Then let's stop him. Lightning flashed briefly across the darkening sky, illuminating the river in sharp, white light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm arrived suddenly. Rain crashed against the metal roof of the workshop, drowning out the distant sounds of the town. Caleb moved to shut the door before the wind pushed it open again. When he turned back, Rachel was already spreading the documents across the table again. Look at this, she said. Caleb walked closer. She pointed to a construction timeline printed across one page. The final reinforcement phase of the dam happened 3 months ago. Caleb nodded slowly. That's the section most vulnerable to pressure. Rachel tapped another line. But the material invoice attached to that phase lists industrial concrete shipped from a supplier that doesn't exist. Caleb leaned closer, reading the page again. His expression darkened. I checked that address once, he said. Empty warehouse. Rachel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Meaning? Caleb spoke quietly. Meaning the reinforcement material was never delivered. The sound of thunder followed almost immediately after the lightning, this time closer and heavier. Rachel looked toward the dark river beyond the windows. So what's holding the dam together right now? Caleb's answer came after a long pause. Probably less than anyone thinks. The rain continued pounding the roof, turning the workshop into a small island of light and sound. Caleb pulled another folder from the cabinet and opened it beside the others. If Miller's been diverting funds, he said. The only way to prove it is to find physical evidence. Rachel looked up. Where? Caleb met her eyes. Inside the dam construction site. Rachel smiled slowly despite the tension building around them. Breaking into a restricted government project. Caleb shrugged slightly. You're the journalist. Rachel crossed her arms. And you're the lawyer. Caleb's expression softened just slightly for the first time since she met him. Former lawyer. Rachel tilted her head. Temporary condition. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade behind the quiet understanding passing between them. They were no longer strangers arguing in a bar. They were partners standing at the edge of something dangerous. Caleb closed the final folder. If we do this, he said, there's no turning back. Rachel met his gaze steadily. I never planned to. Lightning flashed again, reflecting across the dark water of the river. Somewhere beyond the trees, the dam held back thousands of tons of pressure, while the storm above Ock-Haven continued to grow stronger. The night had fallen fully over Ock-Haven, but the storm continued unabated. Rain pelted the streets, filling the gutters with dark, moving water. Rachel and Caleb crouched behind a line of trees near the edge of the construction site. The floodlights from the dam cast harsh beams into the rain, creating long, distorted shadows. They had planned this carefully. The gates were lightly guarded at night, but the paths through the woods offered cover. Caleb checked his watch. Shift change in 10 minutes. That's our window. Rachel nodded, holding her bag of documents tightly against her chest. Every step they took through the mud-soaked underbrush was calculated. Her boots sank slightly into the soil, leaving deep impressions. He moved silently beside her, the years of living off the grid visible in his careful, deliberate pace. They reached the chain-link fence that marked the perimeter. Rachel pulled a small wire cutter from her coat. Caleb crouched beside her. "This is where most people stop," he murmured. "I've been past this fence more times than I care to count." The cutter bit through the metal quickly. With a soft click, the fence yielded. They slipped through. Inside, the site was eerily quiet. Large piles of gravel and concrete mixers gleamed under the floodlights, wet and slick. Rachel's heart thumped in her chest. Every noise, water dripping, metal groaning, felt magnified. She could feel the weight of the story pressing against her, the realization that the evidence of years of corruption was literally beneath their feet. Caleb led the way to a partially constructed section of the dam. The walls rose like jagged teeth against the dark sky. "Here," he whispered, pointing to a section where the concrete looked uneven, the texture off. Rachel took out her camera and began photographing the inconsistencies. Cracks ran along areas where reinforcement should have been solid. Rainwater dripped from the top, highlighting the flaws. She flipped through the invoices again. "These payments, they claim industrial concrete was poured here 3 months ago, but it's clearly not reinforced properly." Caleb knelt beside the wall, running a gloved hand along the damp surface. "It's like they poured sand and called it concrete." His voice was low, almost a growl. "If the wall gives, people could die." Rachel's stomach tightened, but she kept photographing, documenting every irregularity. Her journalistic instincts overrode fear. Caleb motioned toward a locked storage container. Inside, he suspected, were the original delivery records and receipts, proof they needed. They approached silently. Caleb picked the lock within seconds, the mechanism clicking open under his practiced hands. Inside the container, stacks of invoices, delivery logs, and contractor notes were arranged in messy piles. Rachel quickly scanned, then grabbed files most relevant. Caleb worked beside her, cross-referencing dates with the drone photographs she had taken earlier. Every piece confirmed what they feared. Money had been siphoned, materials substituted, corners cut deliberately, all with Sheriff Miller's knowledge and tacit approval. Suddenly, a light beam cut across the site. A security guard had returned early, flashlights scanning in their direction. Caleb grabbed Rachel's arm and pulled her to a shadowed alcove behind a pile of gravel. They froze, rain dripping from their clothes. The guard muttered to himself and moved on, his flashlight swinging away. Rachel exhaled silently, her hands shaking slightly. "We can't stay here long," Caleb whispered. "We have enough to expose this. But Miller will know someone was here." Rachel nodded, understanding the stakes. Every photograph, every document they collected was proof and a threat. As they slipped back through the fence into the woods, Rachel's mind raced. She had come to Ock-Haven seeking a story about corruption. Now she carried the evidence of potential disaster, a dam built on lies and greed. Caleb moved beside her silently, the rain soaking them both. They were partners now, bound by necessity and the growing trust between them. By the time they returned to Caleb's workshop, drenched and exhausted, Rachel spread the files across the table. "This is everything," she said, her voice taut with adrenaline. Caleb studied the papers, then nodded slowly. "Miller is going to fight back hard," he said. "But we can't stop now." Rachel met his gaze. "We won't." Outside, the storm began to relent slightly, but the tension inside the room was electric. The fight for the truth, and for Ock-Haven, had only just begun. Morning arrived gray and heavy with lingering storm clouds. Rachel had barely slept. Her notebook lay open beside her, filled with scribbled observations, timestamps, and tentative plans. Caleb moved quietly around the workshop, organizing the evidence they had retrieved, careful not to leave anything out of place. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the river beyond the docks remained high and restless. Rachel sipped her coffee in silence, thinking through their next move. "We need a way to communicate without him intercepting," she said finally. Caleb looked up from a stack of invoices, a small, knowing smile crossing his face. "I've already thought of that." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, folded note. "This will get to you without Miller knowing. Only you'll understand the code." Rachel took the note and unfolded it. It was written in shorthand, legal jargon interlaced with references that only she and Caleb would recognize. the kind of thing they had spent hours discussing over documents and drone photographs. Her eyes scanned the lines, comprehension dawning quickly. "You're saying he can't touch this?" Caleb nodded. "Not if you keep it to the system we've built. And not if you act fast." They spent the morning cross-referencing each document, each photograph, and each invoice. Every line drew a tighter web of corruption. Shell corporations, inflated invoices, falsified delivery receipts, and payments routed through Miller's re-election fund. Rachel's hands shook slightly as she organized the folders. This is enough to bring him down," she whispered. Caleb's eyes were dark with resolve. "If we get it to the right people. If we don't hesitate." By midday, Rachel knew they needed to act. Miller's influence was subtle, but everywhere, and the slightest misstep could undo everything. Caleb handed her the final set of files, detailed invoices and photographs of the dam's substandard construction. "This goes to the editorial office in the Capitol. We can't afford delays." Rachel nodded, sliding the files carefully into a waterproof satchel. Before she could leave, Caleb placed a hand on her shoulder. "Remember," he said quietly, "he'll try to make you doubt me. Or himself. Or both. Trust no distractions." Rachel met his eyes, her determination hardening. "I trust you." Caleb nodded once, and for the first time, his guarded expression softened. Outside, the town remained calm, unaware of the storm of revelations about to hit it. Rachel climbed into her pickup and started the engine. The drizzle dampened her hair, but her focus was clear. Every red light, every turn, every mile closer to the Capitol felt like a countdown to the moment Miller would realize someone had started digging. Meanwhile, Caleb returned to the workshop and stared out at the dam. The rain had carved rivulets across the concrete, highlighting the flaws even more starkly than the photographs could convey. He knew this was only the beginning. Miller would not give up easily. But Caleb had waited 10 years for this chance, and now, with Rachel as his ally, he was ready to confront the corruption that had driven him from his career and threatened the town he had never left behind. The river roared quietly beneath the dam, carrying with it the unspoken danger of collapse. And above it all, the clouds shifted, revealing faint slivers of sunlight, a reminder that even in Ock-Haven, truth had a way of finding its light. Rachel drove on, oblivious to the looming threat of confrontation, carrying evidence that could shatter the carefully constructed illusions of power, while Caleb prepared silently, every moment sharpening the strategy for the inevitable clash with Miller. That evening, the calm in Ock-Haven was deceptive. The streets glistened from earlier rain, reflecting the amber light of street lamps, and the dam loomed silently in the distance. Rachel returned from the Capitol's editorial office, where she had sent copies of the photographs and documents via secure channels. She knew the moment those files reached the editors, the story would ignite. But returning to the town meant danger. Sheriff Miller would notice the breach immediately. Caleb met her at the edge of the woods near the dock. He had checked the perimeter twice already. "Did you send everything?" he asked quietly. Rachel nodded, pulling her phone from her pocket. "All copies uploaded. Editors confirmed receipt. It's out of my hands now." Caleb studied her face. "Good. But that means Miller will be moving tonight. He won't just let it sit." As they walked toward the workshop, a car's headlights flashed in the distance. Caleb pulled Rachel into the shadow of the trees. Two men in dark coats exited the vehicle, moving swiftly toward the dam's administrative offices. Caleb's jaw tightened. "They're trying to intercept the evidence. Or destroy it." Rachel swallowed hard. "Do we confront them?" Caleb shook his head. "Not yet. We need a plan. This isn't about a fight anymore. It's about control. We force him to play by our rules." He led her back to the workshop and began checking locks and securing the evidence they had gathered. "Everything here," he said, "has to be bulletproof. Every document, every photo, every backup." Rachel organized the files again, her mind racing. The town had been asleep for decades while money was siphoned, contracts falsified, and the dam left vulnerable. If Miller realized the story had reached beyond Ock-Haven, he would act fast, possibly recklessly. They had to anticipate every move. Hours later, the phone in Rachel's bag vibrated, a coded message from Caleb. She glanced at it quickly. "All clear. Pattern intact. Follow night protocol." Her pulse quickened. They had rehearsed this protocol in private, a set of signals and movements to communicate silently if Miller tried to interfere directly. The night deepened. Rain returned in soft patters, mist rising from the river. Rachel and Caleb moved toward the restricted area near the dam, using the cover of darkness and the fog. Every step was careful, deliberate. Caleb knew the terrain perfectly. Every hidden path, every loose plank, every sound of shifting water was mapped in his mind. At the perimeter, Rachel used her camera again, documenting subtle weaknesses in the dam's reinforcement. Caleb directed her lens toward the base of the primary spillway. "Look at the efflorescence," he whispered, pointing to thick, white mineral crusts bleeding through the concrete. "That's not just age, it's internal erosion. They used unwashed river sand high in chlorides." He kicked a section of the masonry, and a chunk of the facade crumbled like dry biscuit, revealing smooth and bonded rebar beneath. There's no deformation on the steel. They used smooth-grade rods instead of high-strength ribbed rebar to save 40% on material costs. Under a full reservoir load, there's zero mechanical bond to prevent the concrete from sliding right off the skeleton. Rachel captured a macro shot of the rusted, slick metal, the physical proof of a structural skeleton that was never meant to hold. The physical proof matched perfectly with the financial records they had recovered. Suddenly, a flashlight beam cut through the fog. Both of them froze. Caleb grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her into a shadowed corner. A guard, unaware of their exact position, passed by, muttering under his breath. Caleb waited until the beam swung away, then led Rachel to a small maintenance hatch they had located earlier. Inside were old contractor logs, hard copies that would definitively confirm the fraudulent materials and payments. Rachel photographed each page, her hands steady despite the adrenaline. They exited the hatch quietly, back into the fog and mist, carrying enough proof to confront Miller publicly. Caleb checked over his shoulder. "We leave nothing behind. Nothing that can be traced back to us until the time is right." Rachel nodded. "Then we wait." By the time they returned to the workshop, rain had stopped. The river flowed quietly, but Rachel could feel the tension. Every moment they delayed, Miller's awareness increased. Tonight, the town was silent, but tomorrow, the storm of exposure would begin. And when it did, neither Ock-Haven nor Miller would be able to bury the truth again. The night ended with a brief calm. Caleb sat by the window, watching the dam. Rachel organized the final photographs on the table. Both knew what was coming next: the confrontation, the risk, and the reckoning that would determine whether Ock-Haven would survive its secrets, or whether the dam, and the corruption it concealed, would destroy everything. Dawn arrived pale and gray, the storm's remnants still dripping from the trees. Rachel was already at the workshop table, reviewing every photograph and invoice once more. Caleb moved silently beside her, organizing the folders in precise order. "We can't make a single mistake," he said. "One slip and Miller will bury this story, and anyone who helped uncover it." Rachel nodded, the weight of what they were about to do pressing against her chest. By mid-morning, they had assembled everything needed: drone photographs, contractor logs, invoices, and Caleb's detailed notes. Rachel's hands moved quickly, uploading encrypted copies to multiple secure channels while Caleb watched the street from the window. Every passing car made them tense. Miller's reach in the town was long. Even a casual sighting could compromise them. Suddenly, Caleb stiffened. "He's moving," he whispered. Rachel followed his gaze toward the far end of the dock. Sheriff Miller's black SUV appeared, rolling slowly toward the river access road. Rachel's stomach dropped. "He knows," she said. Caleb shook his head slightly. "Not yet. He's testing, watching." They had only moments. Caleb grabbed Rachel's bag with the hard copies and gestured toward the hidden path through the woods. "Move fast. Stay silent." Rain from earlier had soaked the ground. Each step left a deep impression, but the forest muffled the sound. They reached a small clearing where Caleb had parked a spare vehicle. Rachel climbed in while he scanned the surrounding trees. Miller's SUV paused at the edge of the property. A tense minute passed. Caleb started the engine, and they moved quickly along the hidden paths he had memorized over years of solitude. The SUV followed at a distance, headlights slicing through the morning mist. Rachel clutched her bag tighter. Every mile increased the risk, but also the inevitability of confrontation. Finally, Caleb guided them to a secluded stretch of road near a wooded ridge. They parked and waited. Rachel checked her watch. The encrypted copies had reached the editorial office, and confirmation emails had already started arriving. The story would break soon. Miller, however, was not done. The SUV pulled up abruptly ahead, forcing them to stop. The sheriff stepped out, expression cold, the weight of control radiating from him. "You've been busy," Miller said, voice low but lethal. "I should have warned you about boundaries." Caleb exited the vehicle slowly, hands visible but steady. "Boundaries were crossed long ago," he said. Rachel stepped out beside him, holding the satchel. "Your corruption is documented. The town will see it all." Miller laughed softly, the sound echoing through the mist. "Do you really think that changes anything? Ock-Haven doesn't follow the law. It obeys me." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Not anymore." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small recording device. "Everything you've done, every falsified document, every cut corner, it's all recorded. Confess, or the evidence goes public." Miller's jaw tightened, his hand darting toward the holster at his hip in a blurred, instinctive motion. Before he could clear leather, Caleb stepped into his space, his hand clamping down on Miller's wrist with a strength born of years hauling boat engines. "Don't," Caleb hissed, the metal of the recorder pressed between them like a blade. "There's a federal wiretap authorization already pending on your personal accounts, Daniel. If I go down, the encryption key for the Ridgeline offshore files goes to the Attorney General's office instantly." Miller froze, his breath hitching as he stared into Caleb's unyielding eyes. The weight of the legal trap, combined with the physical stalemate, finally broke the sheriff's composure. His hand went limp, sliding away from the weapon as the realization hit. The silence he had spent a decade building had finally turned into his prison. Miller paused, realization dawning. Caleb had anticipated everything. The secluded location, the recorder, the fact that the press office already held copies of every document. The sheriff's power relied on secrecy, and now that secrecy was gone. Slowly, Miller raised his hands. Caleb pressed a button on the recorder, capturing Miller's confession. Rachel held her phone discreetly, recording video simultaneously. The tension broke, replaced by a heavy, controlled silence. The storm outside had ended, leaving Ock-Haven damp but clear. Caleb nodded to Rachel. "It's done." Rachel exhaled, relief flooding her. Miller's shadow over the town had been lifted, and for the first time, the community could see truth. By the time they returned to the workshop, the sun had begun to break through the clouds. Rachel spread the documents across the table one final time, confirming their completeness. Caleb leaned back, exhausted but resolute. "Half a year ago, this town was controlled by fear," he said. "Now, it's controlled by evidence." Rachel smiled, feeling the weight of the months of work lift. The fight was over. For now, Ock-Haven could finally breathe. Tomorrow, the town would awaken to the revelations. And today, in the quiet aftermath, Rachel and Caleb could finally allow themselves a moment of victory, knowing they had not just exposed corruption, they had protected lives, restored justice, and reclaimed the town from decades of silence. 6 months had passed since the scandal broke. Ock-Haven had begun to change, quietly but unmistakably. The dam, once a symbol of negligence and greed, was now crawling with federal inspectors and legitimate engineering crews. The long process of structural reinforcement had finally begun under transparent management. Caleb had reclaimed his legal license and now served as the town's interim district prosecutor, ensuring the law was applied evenly for the first time in a decade. Rachel had settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly like home. Her bestseller, chronicling the corruption of the Golden State Dam, had made waves nationally, but she had chosen to stay in Ock-Haven to oversee the fallout. One evening, they stood together on the veranda of Caleb's home, watching the sunset bleed into the river. "The engineers say the new foundation will be set by winter," Caleb said, his voice lacking its old edge of cynicism. Rachel leaned against the railing, watching the amber light reflect off the water. "It's a start," she replied, resting her hand on his. "For the town and for us." The silence that followed wasn't heavy with secrets anymore, but with the quiet promise of a future they had fought to make possible.